Being a person who grew up reading Scripture, trusting Scripture, and now here's a child talking to me about what he saw. But for me, the advantage was, as a parent, you know when a 4-year-old's telling you the truth, and you know when a 4-year-old cannot invent the things he's saying. And I know what he gets taught at church. There's no way he had the depth, the understanding, the things he was sharing. He couldn't read at the time, and he was talking about things that no 4-year-old's ever going to read in Scripture or be taught in church, and he was still right. And so it took me a while, but finally I realized that he was spot on, and this was true.
I never believed that life could change in the blink of an eye, until the day mine did. What I'm going to tell you here is not a simple experience, a dream or a delirium caused by an accident. I was between two worlds. I saw things that defy any logical explanation. I felt a truth that few are prepared to hear. And now, all I can do is tell you what I saw and hope that someone somewhere is willing to understand. What started as an ordinary day ended with my soul out of my body, moving through silent darkness, heading towards something that words cannot fully describe. There, I saw the future, a future that can still be avoided, but only if people open their eyes before it's too late. I saw destruction, chaos, and despair, but I also saw hope. I saw that not all is lost, but the choice needs to be made now. I know many will doubt it. I know some will laugh. But I also know that this message is not for them. It is for those who feel deep down that something is changing. For those who know that the world cannot continue as it is without consequences. If you've made it this far, maybe it's because this story has something to say to you. My name is Ethan, and I never imagined I would be telling you something like this. If someone had told me that one day I would cross the border between life and death, I would have laughed and gone on with my routine. But what happened that day was real as the air I breathe now. I saw things that defied logical explanation, and what I learned changed my view of the world forever. I know many will doubt it, but that doesn't matter. I need to tell my story, because it might not just be about me. Maybe it's a warning. It was an ordinary Tuesday, nothing special. I woke up late, as usual, skipped breakfast, and rushed off to college. My worries were the same as any college student's: deadlines, assignments, and tests piling up. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. After the last class of the day, I decided to take a different route. Home. The sky was blue, and the cool wind made the ride pleasant. In that moment, I felt a strange tranquility, as if everything was exactly as it should be. Little did I know that, in just a few minutes, my life would change forever. As I pedaled, I heard a sharp sound, tires skidding violently on the asphalt. My heart raced. I turned my head and saw a car coming at high speed. My body reacted before my mind could process. I tried to dodge, but it was too late. The impact was overwhelming. My body was thrown into the air, and everything around me spun in slow motion. I saw the sky, then the ground, and then I felt the dry thump against the asphalt. The shock was instantaneous, but strangely, the pain disappeared almost immediately. The world around me began to fade. I could still hear voices, sirens, and running footsteps, but these sounds seemed to come from far away. It was as if I was moving away from the scene of the accident, being pulled to an unknown place. My breathing became light, almost non-existent. Then everything went dark. But it wasn't the kind of darkness we know. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a deep void, silent, but somehow welcoming. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel pain. Just a strange peace came over me. It was at that moment that something happened that I will never forget. My entire life flashed before my eyes, not as vague memories, but as if I was reliving every moment. I saw my childhood, my mistakes, my successes, the people I loved, and those I hurt. Each scene was clear, full of emotions, and then everything stopped. The last memory disappeared, and I realized I was no longer in the world I knew. I had crossed to the other side. My name is Ethan, and I never thought I would one day write something like this. If someone had told me that I would cross the line between life and death, I would have laughed and gone on with my day. But what happened to me was real, as real as the air I breathe now. I have seen things that defy explanation and felt something that words cannot fully describe. What I experienced changed my way of seeing the world. I know many won't believe it, but that doesn't matter. I need to tell this story, because maybe it's not just about me. Maybe it's about all of us. It was a Tuesday, like any other. I woke up late, skipped breakfast, and rushed to college. My head was full of silly worries, deadlines, tests, accumulated work. After the last class, I decided to take a different route. Home. The day was beautiful. The cool wind hit my face, and for a moment I felt a strange peace. I should have paid attention to this feeling, because just a few minutes later, everything changed. In a matter of seconds, my life took a path I could never have predicted. As I pedaled, I heard a loud sound, tires skidding on the asphalt. My heart raced. I turned my head and saw a car coming too fast. My body reacted before my mind. I tried to avoid it, but it was too late. The impact was brutal. My body was thrown into the air, spinning in the air. I saw the sky, then the ground, and then I felt the impact against the asphalt. The blow should have hurt, but strangely, the pain disappeared almost immediately. Everything around me went silent, and then I began to withdraw from the world. My vision went dark, but I was still conscious. I could hear voices in the distance, ambulance sirens, screams of despair. But these sounds seemed to belong to another world. It was as if I were floating above the scene of the accident, watching everything happen without being part of it. My breathing became light, my mind was calm, and then I felt something was pulling me. It wasn't scary, nor was it painful. It was just different. It was like I was being taken to some other place, a place I didn't understand. It was at that moment that everything happened. My entire life flashed before my eyes, not as loose memories, but as if I were reliving every moment. I saw my childhood, the mistakes I made, the people I loved, and those I hurt. Each scene was accompanied by emotions so intense that I felt like I was living it all over again. And then, everything stopped. Silence took over me, and when I looked around, I realized it was no longer there. I had crossed to the other side. The silence around me was absolute. There was no pain, fear, or any sensation that I could recognize. Just a peaceful emptiness, like I was suspended in something that wasn't quite space. I knew something had changed, that I was no longer tied to the world I knew. My senses seemed different, sharper, but at the same time, limited. I tried to talk, to scream, to move my body, but there was no body to move. I existed, but not in the same way. It was then that I realized I was between two worlds. Time seemed irrelevant there. I didn't know if seconds or hours had passed. I began to see images forming around me, fragments of memories appearing and disappearing like smoke. I saw the day I learned to ride a Tao bike, the childhood birthdays, the silly fights with my brother. Each scene brought with it a strong emotion, as if I were experiencing it all over again. But it wasn't just a memory. It was like I was being forced to face every choice I made, every mistake, and every moment of joy. I felt something different approaching, a weight in the air, a presence that I couldn't see, but that I knew was there. It was then that I heard the voices. First a distant whisper, then several voices mixing. Some were calm, almost comforting, while others carried an unsettling urgency. They spoke in tones I didn't fully understand, but the message was clear. I shouldn't be there yet. Something was waiting for me up ahead. But what? The darkness around me was not empty. Little by little, I began to notice that there was something moving about her. Something that I couldn't see clearly, but that I knew I was watching. The silence wasn't so peaceful anymore. There was something in the darkness, something that seemed to test my presence there. I tried to walk away, but there was nowhere to go. It was at this moment that, in the distance, a small light appeared. At first, it was just a faint, barely noticeable glow. But as I looked, the light began to grow, calling out to me. I didn't know what that light meant, but something inside me told me that was where I should go. The voices grew louder, some pleading, others warning. The darkness around me seemed to resist, as if it didn't want me to move forward. But somehow I knew I needed to keep going. I focused all my will on that light and began to move towards it. And as I got closer, the darkness began to recede, as if it was yielding to the presence of that light. The light in front of me grew every moment, radiating a brightness that didn't hurt the eyes, but seemed to pierce my very existence. I didn't walk towards it because I didn't have a body, but I felt like I was moving, being taken closer. Around me, the darkness retreated, reluctantly, as if resisting that glow. But even as the light grew, the voices in the darkness did not disappear. They were there, whispering words I couldn't fully understand, some filled with desperation, others with a strange sweetness. I tried to focus on them, trying to distinguish who was speaking and what they were saying. Some voices sounded familiar, like echoes of distant memories, but others were new, unlike anything I had ever heard before. They didn't speak to me directly, but it felt like I was listening to something forbidden, conversations that didn't belong to the world I knew. I felt a shiver, but not from fear. It was as if I was bumping into something I shouldn't have. But then, the light grew even brighter, and for the first time, I felt like something bigger was calling me. Suddenly, the light transformed. From a simple distant glow, it lengthened into something that seemed like a tunnel, a path of infinite light that stretched beyond my understanding. I felt its pull, as if I were being pulled by a force I couldn't resist. The voices in the darkness grew more agitated. Some begged me not to move forward, while others seemed to encourage my journey. What was on the other side of that tunnel? And why did some voices seem to want to stop me from getting there? I kept moving, faster and faster. The tunnel of light was not a simple path. It vibrated, pulsated, as if it were alive. I felt his energy all around me, enveloping me in a way that was both comforting and overwhelming. It was as if every part of me was being analyzed, understood, stripped of any illusion. Inside, there were no masks, lies, or secrets. I was just me, exposed to the absolute truth. And for the first time, I began to wonder if I was prepared for what came next. It was then that everything stopped. The tunnel disappeared, and I found myself facing something impossible to fully describe. It wasn't just light. It wasn't just space. It was a place that transcended any explanation, a plane where time did not exist. And right in front of me, emerging from the glow, were figures I didn't recognize but who seemed to know me. They didn't speak, but their eyes said it all. It was at that moment that I realized I was about to meet someone who would change my life forever. The figures before me shone with a light that was not of this world. It wasn't just an intense glow, but something that seemed to emanate from within them, as if they were made of pure energy. I couldn't make out faces clearly, but I knew I wasn't alone. They were there, watching me, waiting. My instinct should have been to back away, but something inside me told me I needed to move forward. It was then that, from among the light, a presence stood out. When I looked at him, I immediately knew who he was, without anyone having to tell me. He needed no introduction. I knew I was before Jesus. His gaze passed through everything I was, as if he saw every thought, every feeling, every memory that I carried inside me. But what surprised me most was the depth of his gaze. There was no judgment, just understanding. He knew everything about me, and yet his presence wasn't threatening. On the contrary, there was something about him that brought peace, a kind of love that I had never felt before, a pure, absolute love that enveloped me completely. He took a step forward, and his expression became serious. "You need to listen," he said, and his voice echoed inside me as if it wasn't just being heard, but felt. Before I could respond, everything around me began to change. The light surrounding us transformed, and images began to appear before me. It was as if I was being transported to another place, another time. I saw scenes that made me hold my breath, and it was then that I realized that Jesus wasn't just there to comfort me. He was there to show me something that would change everything. What I saw was terrifying. Cities on fire, people running in panic, natural disasters, devastating entire countries. The world I knew was falling apart before my eyes. It wasn't just an isolated event. It was a complete meltdown. Society was falling apart, and the fear was palpable. But amid the chaos, I also saw something else. Small points of light. People who remained firm despite the destruction around them. And in that moment, I understood. What I was seeing was not just a vision. It was a warning. Jesus looked at me again, and this time, there was urgency in his gaze. "Humanity is at a point of choice," he said. "The next few months will define the future." His voice was firm, but there was no desperation, just truth. He wanted me to understand the weight of what I was seeing. The choice was in people's hands, but time was short, and that's when I realized I wasn't just there to witness. I had a mission. I needed to go back. I needed to tell the world what was coming. Before me, images continued to form, as if I were being transported to a future that had not yet happened. What I saw first was a city I immediately recognized, New York. But she wasn't like I remembered. The sky was dark, not from the night, but from the smoke rising from the burning buildings. The streets, which used to be full of life, were now filled with chaos. People ran desperately, some carrying what they could, others simply trying to escape something invisible but terrifying. The fear was almost palpable. Then, the scenes changed. Other cities appeared. Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C., all collapsed. I saw protests turning into violent clashes. I saw empty markets, families separated, political leaders giving speeches, but their words were empty, with no effect on the despair that gripped the population. The economy had collapsed, and with it, the social order. What had once seemed solid was now crumbling, like a great structure corroded from within. The year that shone before me, highlighted amidst the images, was clear. 2025. I saw natural disasters, on a scale I could never have imagined. Hurricanes leveling entire cities, fires consuming forests and reaching urban neighborhoods, earthquakes collapsing buildings as if they were made of paper. The planet seemed to be revolting, as if it were reacting to something much bigger than the physical disasters themselves. And then, in the midst of it all, I saw something even more frightening. The divide between people was growing to an irreversible level. Fear and hatred were spreading like a plague, making people blind to any hope. But among the ruins and despair, there were small points of light. I saw groups of people coming together, helping each other, praying together. Churches that were once empty were now full of believers seeking guidance, seeking something that would give them the strength to continue. I saw hands outstretched, where before there was only division. And it was then that I realized, even in the midst of chaos, faith still resisted. Jesus showed me that destruction was not inevitable, but that people's choices would determine what happened next. There was still hope, but time was short. The vision began to fade, and I found myself before Jesus again. His gaze was firm, but there was compassion in it. "The world can still change," he said, "but people need to open their eyes before it's too late." He didn't promise me that everything would be fine. He didn't guarantee me that the worst would be avoided, but he made it clear that everyone had a role in this story. "Go and tell what you saw," he said. so that those who want to listen can prepare. And before I could ask anything, I felt something pulling me away. The images kept changing before me, taking me deeper and deeper into what seemed like an inevitable future. I saw rulers in palaces and parliaments, surrounded by luxury while the world around them burned. Speeches were made before crowds, but the words were empty, without truth, without impact. People were tired of broken promises, and frustration was growing like a spark, about to set everything on fire. The government, which should be a pillar of stability, was collapsing along with society. Fear took over the streets. I saw countries that were once strong collapsing. Money lost its value, banks closed their doors, and markets were looted in search of food. Unemployment reached unimaginable levels, forcing entire families to live on the streets. Desperation turned neighbors into enemies, and the fight for survival erased any sense of compassion. In some regions, the law no longer existed. Armed groups took control, imposing their own rules. What was once a civilized society now seemed like a battlefield. There was a moment in the vision when I saw something even worse, the division between people becoming irreversible. Nobody trusted anyone anymore. Former friends became adversaries, brothers grew apart, communities fragmented over small differences. Hatred grew like a silent disease, infecting everyone. I saw demonstrations turning into battles, cities being taken over by internal conflicts. It wasn't just governments that were crumbling, it was human relationships. The world was breaking in half. But in the midst of this darkness, I saw something different. Small groups of people refused to give in to fear and hatred. They got together, helped each other, shared what they had. Where chaos reigned, they brought order. Where there was despair, they brought faith. I saw churches that were once empty now becoming refuges. It was not a question of religion, but of hope. These groups had no political power, no great fortunes or armies, but they had something that the others had lost, the ability to believe that there was still a way back. The vision began to fade, and I found myself before Jesus again. His look was not one of condemnation, but of sadness. "This doesn't need to happen," he said, "but people's choices will determine what comes next." He wasn't showing me a fixed destination, but a warning of what was to come if nothing changed. The future could still be changed, but to do so, people needed to wake up. "Time is short," he continued. "You must go back and tell what you saw." Before I could say anything, I felt something pulling me away from that place. The feeling of being pulled back was intense, as if something was ripping me away from that place with an irresistible force. But before I could be completely taken away, Jesus looked at me once more. His face was firm, but at the same time it carried infinite compassion. "There is time, but we need to act now," he said. His voice was not a request, but an absolute truth, something I felt echoing inside me. Then, in an instant, everything around me disappeared, and I was enveloped again by darkness and absolute silence. But this time the silence was not empty. There was something different about him, something that made my heart feel heavy. What I had seen was not just a warning, but a calling. Humanity was faced with a choice, and this choice could not be postponed. I saw flashes of people who had not yet awakened, those who lived their lives trapped in empty routines, consumed by materialism, by selfishness, by the tireless search for something that would never fill the void within them. They were spiritually asleep, not noticing the signs around them. Jesus' calling was not just for me, but for everyone. He didn't ask people to hide or run away from what was coming. He wanted them to become stronger, to turn to faith, to the truth, to what really mattered. It didn't matter the religion, it didn't matter the divisions that the world created. What mattered was the essence of the message: love, compassion, unity. Only those who saw beyond illusions could endure what was to come. Faith was not just a refuge, but the only answer to prevent the worst. I felt inside me that many would ignore this message. Many would continue living as if nothing were happening, trapped in their own certainties, disbelieving the signs. But I also knew there would be those who would understand. I saw in my mind people gathering, praying, helping each other. Small acts of kindness that could make the difference between total darkness and hope. The future was not sealed. What would happen next would depend on the choices that were made now. And then I felt one last tug, stronger than any before. My senses began to return, first in a whirlwind of disjointed sensations, the sound of voices, the throbbing pain in my body, the blinding light above me. I was returning. My mission was not yet over. I no longer had any doubts. I needed to tell the world what I had seen, before it was too late. My body felt heavy, like I was being pulled back into something that no longer belonged to me. My eyes slowly opened, dazzled by the white light that illuminated everything around me. At first, I didn't understand where I was. The sound of machines beeping, voices murmuring, and the smell of disinfectant slowly filled my mind. I was in a hospital. The impact of the accident hadn't killed me, but something inside me told me I wasn't the same anymore. I had seen something that no one would easily believe. I tried to move, and a sharp pain shot through my body. My ribs hurt, my leg was immobilized, and my head throbbed like it was about to explode. But despite the physical pain, what shook me most was the weight of what I had experienced. The visions, the words of Jesus, the future I had witnessed. All of it was engraved on my soul. I closed my eyes for a deep breath. I needed to process everything. I needed to understand what. But before I could think any further, a soft voice called out, "You're awake," her face expressing relief. "Everyone was worried about you." I tried to respond, but my throat felt dry, as if I hadn't spoken in years. Little by little, memories began to return. The accident, the impact, the feeling of floating away from my body. The world around me felt distant, as if I wasn't yet completely connected to it. But then, something caught my attention. At the edge of my bed, my mother held my hands, praying silently. His face was marked by tiredness, but his eyes shone with faith. That scene touched me in a way I didn't expect. My mother had never been very religious, but here she was, asking God to bring me back. And somehow, he had responded. I thought about the little lights I saw, amid the chaos of visions. Was that how it started? A simple act of faith, a sincere prayer, a hope placed in something greater. The answer came not in words, but in a feeling deep within me. There were miracles happening even in the darkness. Small, silent, but real. As I rested, I began to realize that something bigger was happening around me. I wasn't the only one to have experiences like this. Nurses talked about patients who had survived against all odds. Doctors reported inexplicable cures. Each story, each account, seemed to form a pattern. God was acting, giving signs, showing that there was still hope. But who was paying attention? Were people ready to listen? Was I ready to tell? The days that followed were a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Physically, I was recovering, but inside, something had changed irreversibly. The visions were still vivid in my mind, as if I had actually lived them and not just witnessed them. Every detail, every frightened face, every destroyed city, everything remained clear. But what echoed most within me were the words of Jesus. Time is short. I needed to tell the world what I had seen, but the question was, as? I tried to rehearse the words in my head, but everything seemed too big, impossible to explain. Who would believe me? Who would listen without calling me crazy? Even the doctors, who had witnessed my inexplicable recovery, thought I was just confused by the trauma. My friends came to visit me, happy that I was alive, but they always diverted the topic when I tried to tell them what had happened. You hit your head hard, Ethan. Maybe it was just a dream, but I knew. It wasn't a dream. My mother was the first to notice my restlessness. One night, while everyone was gone, she sat next to my bed and held my hand. "You saw something, didn't you?" The question took me by surprise. For a moment I hesitated, but then I realized I needed to start somewhere. I told her everything, every detail, every scene. As he spoke, tears ran down his face. When I finished, she didn't question it. She believed. "If God showed you all this, it's because you have a purpose, Ethan," she said. "But don't expect everyone to be ready to listen." That conversation gave me strength. If my mother could believe it, perhaps there were others who would understand too. But time was passing, and I knew I couldn't wait. The signs were all around us. The world was already changing, and few seemed to notice. I turned on the television to the news and saw exactly what Jesus had shown me. Political conflicts intensifying, natural disasters increasing, fear spreading among the people. It was like watching the collapse begin, but no one saw the full picture. Nobody was ready. That night before bed, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I closed my eyes and prayed, not to ask for something, but to be grateful for being brought back. I didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to spread the message, but I knew I couldn't ignore the call. I wasn't special. I was just someone who had seen what was ahead. But for some reason, Jesus chose to show me. And if he trusted me to carry that message, then I needed to find a way to do it. Before it was too late. Every time I closed my eyes, the visions came back, as clear as the moment I witnessed them. The collapse, the burning cities, the despair in people's eyes. But I also remembered the little points of light, the full churches, the miracles happening. In the midst of destruction. The future was not yet written. I understood that now. But how many would be willing to listen? How many would notice the signs before it was too late? I couldn't force anyone to believe, but I had to try. I started slowly, sharing my experience with a few people. Some listened respectfully, others just looked at me skeptically. It was just a delusion, Ethan. The trauma made your mind create these images. I already expected that. The modern world does not easily accept what cannot be explained scientifically. But from time to time, someone would listen with an open heart. Someone understood. And it was these people who gave me the strength to continue. I knew I couldn't awaken everyone, but maybe I could reach those who were ready to see the truth. The world around me showed no signs of improving. Newspaper headlines spoke of international conflicts, natural disasters, and financial crises. Everything was falling into place with what I had seen. These were not isolated events. It was a succession of events that were leading to something bigger. But people went about their lives distracted, caught up in small problems, without realizing that something much bigger was at stake. The warning was already being given. But how many were paying attention? How many were still spiritually asleep? That night, I had one last dream. Or maybe it was another vision. I saw a huge sand clock. The grains were slowly falling, but the space at the top was running out. Then I heard the voice of Jesus once again. Time is running out. I woke up with my heart racing, feeling a huge weight on me. I knew I couldn't save the world alone. I knew not everyone would believe it. But I also knew that my mission was not to convince, but to alert. Everyone would have to make their own choice. Today, I tell this story not to scare, but to prepare. I don't know exactly what will happen in the next few years, but I know that people need to wake up. I know there is hope, but I also know that it depends on the choices we make now. Some will laugh, others will ignore. But if just one person listens and understands, then it will all be worth it. If you've made it this far, perhaps this message is for you. Time is running out. What will you do with it?